Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. Today we're going to talk about trying to help you think a little bit more precisely, more clearly, more sequentially. A lot of people do what I call hand waving. A lot of my lower rated students, they kind of generalize their moves, even in analytical positions. So I need to talk about what's an analytical position. An analytical position is one where there's meaningful checks, captures, and threats. There's some complications, maybe a lot of captures and recaptures. A non-analytical position is more of a judgmental position. For instance, the opening position of the game is fairly non-analytical. There's no checks, captures, or threats for either side. Suppose your opponent opens up A3 and you don't know what to do. You don't have to analyze specific sequences. You could just think in general, which is okay hand waving, to say I want to grab the center with D5 or E5 or just bring out my knight on F6. You know, you can do that in those kind of positions because there's no danger there. But once the two armies start clashing and you get these analytical positions, you might want to use hand waving to generate your candidate moves, but you don't want them to decide your moves. You want to think in very specific sequences. So we're going to try to help you do that today. Let's look first at what would happen if you tried to hand wave. I picked out an old game of mine where I was playing a lower rated player. Obviously white's ahead in development. He has 4 minor pieces out. Black only has 2. White has a rook on a central open file. Black's 2 rooks are in the corner. So white's, even though the material is even, white is way ahead in development. So if we wanted to hand wave this position, we could just kind of look at our checks or look at our developing moves. We could say, well, all our pieces are in the game except for the rook on H1, and we need to castle. Castling is good, so castling, we could castle. If you did that fast, that would be a hand-waving move. We haven't really looked at our checks, captures, and threats. You might analyze the checks very superficially. You might say, oh, I can fork his king and his rook with knight to C7 check. Oh, darn, no, I can't. He'll just take me with his knight, and even though that square's guarded, it wouldn't really do anything to just trade the knights. Or you could look at knight to d6 check and say, well, yeah, I can check him. If he moves the king, he can't castle, but he can always just take me with the bishop. And then what does that do? So that would be kind of a hand-waving way of looking at it. And if you, based on those ideas, if you decided just to castle because you don't have any winning moves on the other side, or maybe you wanted to make a move to threaten something, who knows what that would be, you could just make a move. But that would be hand-waving. So now let's try to do a little bit the opposite. Let's analyze specific sequences, and we want to start with our checks, captures, and threats. Well, let's list them first before we analyze them. Knight C7 check is on the list. Knight D6 check is on the list. But as we said, if we play Knight D6 check and he trades off, what does that do? Well, it wins the bishop pair for one thing. After bishop takes D6, we could take back with the rook or the bishop, probably the bishop. But we could also enforce that idea and play Knight to E4. Which is not a check or a capture, but it is a threat. Why is it a threat? Because now we have 2 knights on the d6 square, and if we put one there and he takes us, we can take back with a knight and get all kinds of forking possibilities. So for instance, suppose we play knight e4 and he plays a silly move like does nothing. Let's say he plays h6. And then we play, let's say, knight on b5 to d6 check. If he just moves the king, we have the removal of the guard with knight takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop takes a6. If you can't visualize that, let's show you on the board. Knight e4 has a threat. How can we tell? If he does sort of nothing, we can check. And now no matter what he does, let's say he moves the king, we can always play knight takes c8, rook takes c8, bishop takes a6, because the bishop on c8 was guarding the knight, and now it's not. So that becomes a threat that he needs to stop. So how could he stop that threat? Well, if he moves the knight to stop the threat, then we have knight c5, knight c7 check. So he can't do that. What else could he do? Well, it turns out the only move he could play, and we can prove this, is king to f8. If he plays his bishop to d7, then when we check with the knight on b5, his knight on a6 would hang. So let's show you that. Bishop d7, knight on b to d6 check, and no matter how he gets out of check, let's say bishop takes, knight takes check, king to e7, we now have bishop takes a6 at the end. So bishop d7 doesn't work. Bishop b7 is even worse because now when we check, we're forking the bishop and the king, so that doesn't work. If he plays knight f6, we still have knight d6 check, followed by knight takes c8, followed by bishop takes a6. So what's the only way he could stop that? Well, he'd have to move the king to f8, and then we don't have that anymore, because now when we play knight to d6, he could play something like knight to c5, which is definitely good for white, but at least he doesn't resign right away. So knight e4 is not bad, but let's look at the other checks. Knight c7 check, knight takes c7, bishop takes c7. What's white threatening? Well, he's probably threatening bishop to b5 check to stop black from castling. Black can't stop that by playing a6 because of bishop takes b6. But black could play bishop to d7. No, he can't, because then we have bishop takes a6. So probably after knight c7, knight takes c7, bishop takes c7, he could play maybe knight f6, and then if bishop to b5 check, he could play knight to d7. Let's take a look at that in case you can't visualize it. Something like that. He could also have put the bishop in the way. And again, white's better, but black's actually getting ready to castle, so he's kind of catching up a little bit in development this way. All right, let's look at knight d6 check first. Again, for the same reason, we're threatening knight takes c8 followed by bishop takes a6. So he pretty much has to take that knight. And now, do we take with the rook or the bishop? Normally you want to take with the undeveloped piece, which is the rook on d1. But that blocks the bishop, and we're not threatening to double rooks for a few more moves. So it's probably better to take with the bishop to stop him from castling kingside. And then if he plays knight e7 to block that diagonal, he still can't castle kingside because that would remove the guard on the knight on e7. What am I talking about? Well, let's do it again. Let's say here white does nothing. Let's say he plays king to e2 or something. Black can't castle. It removes the guard on the knight. The king was guarding the knight. Okay, so knight d6 check, bishop takes, bishop takes. If he plays bishop to b7, he's not really threatening our g2 pawn because his knight on a6 would hang in a lot of lines. So white could kind of ignore him. I know the bishop on g2 would attack the rook on g1, but any move that would solve that situation would probably win. So bishop e7 is playable, but I'm not really worried about the g2 pawn. In a lot of those lines, white can play bishop to bishop to b5 check, which is kind of hard to stop. So let's take a look at that. Knight, check, takes. We're threatening bishop checks, which is annoying. If he puts the bishop in the way, I win the knight. He can't really move the king. If he moves the king to the d file, I should have a discovered attack that wins something. For instance, let's say he does nothing again, and I check, and he plays king d8. I could probably play bishop e5 check, and then take the g pawn. Looks pretty bad. So after bishop takes, he has to do something. Could he play knight to f6? He could, but now his king's still stuck in the middle. We could play bishop to b5 check here. He can't put the bishop in the way because I win the knight on a6. If he puts the knight in the way, his king's kind of stuck. And again, I would try to get my king rook into the game as fast as I could, but I don't have to play bishop to b5 check. He's not really threatening anything because he can't finish his development. So I could just castle. I could play king to e2. I think a lot of things are reasonable here. All right, so this is more specific analysis of lines. We're looking at specific lines. So now what we have to do is evaluate. Let's say our two final candidate moves are knight e4 and knight d6 check. Based on the analysis we just did, we have to assume black's best moves, and then we have to evaluate the position to see which one we like better. Let's turn on the engine now and see what the engine says. Mr. Engine, what do you think about the top 5 moves? Well, you can see that knight e4 did make the 5th best move for a second, but it fell out, and now the computer likes h4 better than that. So if h4, which doesn't do that much, is better than knight e4, we can see that knight d6 check is clearly the best move. After bishop takes d6, white would recapture with the bishop on d6, and black's down by 4.4. We could show you that. You can see bishop takes is plus 4.3, rook takes is only plus 1.8, and no matter what black does, the bishop pair here, normally the bishop pair, having 2 bishops when your opponent doesn't have the 2 bishops, is called the advantage of the bishop pair, which we just call bishop pair for short. So bishop pair doesn't mean you have 2 bishops, it means you do and they don't. If you have the bishop pair, normally the average value of that is a half a pawn. This is a good example of a position where it's more than half a pawn. So our specific analysis says that doing this is better. Did I come up with knight d6 instead of knight e4 like the engine is? No, I'm not as good as the engine. The engine's 20, it's rated 3600 and I'm only 22 something. So I wasn't able to differentiate as well between knight e4 and knight d6 check. But those were my 2 final candidate moves, and indeed knight d6 check is the best move. All right, let's do this again with another game. There's a famous bookseller from Delaware. I believe he's 100 years old now or he's passed away, but his name was Dale Brandreth, and he was a great bookseller in Delaware. If Dale, if you're still around and you're listening, I apologize. I haven't heard from Dale in a while. But this game was played when I was a teenager and Dale was more middle-aged. So I was black, and I think it comes from maybe a Winnower French. Let's turn off the engine. We don't want to see what the engine says. All right, so we have to do the same thing we did before. We have to hand wave first, and then we have to do some real analysis. So to hand wave, we need to count the material. The material is even, but white has the bishop pair now. Half a pawn there, but his bishops aren't very good. The bishop on h5 has no safe moves. The bishop on c1 only has 1 safe move. White is attacking the pawn on f7 with a knight and a bishop. It's guarded by a king and the knight on d8. So that is safe. White has more kingside pawns. Black has more queenside pawns. White has 2 isolated pawns. Black's 6 pawns are all connected with each other, although they are a little dispersed. They're not actually guarding each other. So if we wanted to hand wave a move, we could get the knight on e7 more into the game. We could play knight on e7 to c6. We could play knight to g6. We could get that rook on c8 doing something, maybe rook up to c4 and do some stuff along the 4th rank. We could overprotect our b pawn with a move like a6, or even get our queenside pawns rolling with a move like a5. And if we choose our d4 to guard our pawn on c3 again and maybe block in the bishop. So if we made one of those moves quickly for those reasons, that would be hand waving. Now we're going to do some analysis like we did before. We're looking for checks, captures, and threats. Well, we've got bishop takes c2 check, but that gives up the bishop for that pawn. That gives us a nice protected pass pawn. In fact, connected pass pawns. There are some situations where you sacrifice a piece to get pawns rolling in the middle. Would this be one of them? I kind of doubt it, because after bishop takes c2, king takes c2, the king is a good blockader on those light squares, and we can't easily guard those light squares. So I highly doubt that bishop takes c2 check is worth much analysis. All right, that's our check. How about some captures? Rook takes h5, doubles and isolates his h-pawns, but it's giving up a kind of a, not a bad rook for a very terrible bishop, and that pawn on h5 is actually a dangerous passed pawn that could go to h6 and then h7 and be guarded by the knight. So rook takes h5 doesn't look very good. Any other captures on the board? No. We can't move the knight on d8 because we're guarding f7. So we have those same candidate moves. None of them are really big threats, but one of them is a threat. Which one is it? It's d4. Why is d4 a threat? Because on d4 we're threatening d3, and the pawn on c2 is pinned. So it can't capture on d3. That would be like a sneaky pin kind of issue, because we're not really attacking the pawn on c2 so much as being able to get our pawn to d3, which would attack the pawn on c2, of course. So d4 becomes a very strong candidate move. If we just move it now, that was what we would do in a speed game, you know, in a 5-minute game. But in a slow game, we're going to try to see what he can do about it. So how would he stop us from playing d3? Well, he could play king to e2, and then that stops d3 because of king takes d3. But if he plays king e2 after d4, we could play bishop takes c2, hitting the rook. But then he could play rook takes b5, so that's not completely ridiculous. Let's analyze that. So d4, king e2, bishop takes c2 is not forced. We could play a6 first, threatening bishop takes c2, but then he has king d3. So let's say we play bishop c2, and he plays rook takes b5, and we play d3 check. We're now threatening d2, trapping the bishop. Can he stop that? I don't think he can. He could play king to e3, and then we could play d2, hitting the bishop, and the bishop has no squares, and our bishop on c2 is still safe, and the rook on b5 is not threatening that much. So I'm looking at the line d4, king e2, bishop takes c2, rook takes b5, d3 check, king moves, d2, winning the bishop on c1. So that's actually pretty good. Let's think about this first. We want to be very careful here. So let's say he doesn't want to play king to e2 to guard. Let's say he'll just let us play d3. Can he play bishop to g6? No, we could just take it with a knight or a pawn. Can he bring the knight back and stop d3? Knight to e4, knight to f3 still allows us to play d3. Now he could guard f2 again with the knight, and I could play knight to e1, but that looks awfully bad. So I'm looking at the line d4, knight f3, d3, knight to e1, or knight to d4. Let's say he plays knight to d4. He's not threatening knight takes e6 because our knight on d8 is guarding e6, even though the pawn on f7 is pinned. But we can just play d2, trapping the bishop again. So let's show you that line. Again, you want to visualize these things, use your imagination to guard the pawn on c2, and then we could play here. And now he would give up the bishop for the two pawns. He would definitely play bishop takes d2, c takes d2, king takes d2, and he would have two pawns for the piece with a kingside majority, and my central pawns would be gone. My bishop on a5 wouldn't be all that wonderful. Do I have to win the bishop here? I mean, winning the bishop is good, but do I have a better move? I could try to remove the guard on the c2 pawn. I could play a knight to c6, maybe knight on d8 to c6. If he plays knight takes b5, then I have d takes c2 check, winning the rook. Let's take a look at that. Knight here. Again, this would all be visualized. I wouldn't actually be making the moves like I am in the video. And now I'm just trying to remove that guard on the c2 square. If he takes my knight and I take back, I'm threatening to take here on c2, and he doesn't really have a way to stop that. He can move the rook, but this is looking pretty bad. All right, back to the game. All right, let's take that move back, d4. So d4 is looking like a good candidate move. When you see a good move, of course, look for a better one. What else could I do that would be as threatening and as clever as that? I could play rook to c4, maybe threatening rook to d4 check, and then some other fancy stuff. I guess on rook d4 check, he would move the king, and I'm not threatening rook takes f4. I could play knight g6 and pressure the f4 pawn. Not sure what that does for me. If he plays bishop takes, pawn takes, his knight can't take on e6 because I have my knight on d8. That doesn't look right. I would say pushing the pawn at this point, based on that analysis, is the best idea, and it's hard for white to meet the threat of d3. Let's see what I played in the game. let's switch over from our lead chess board to our chess base board. All right, in the game, I played d4 and I gave it an exclamation point. Doesn't really deserve it. It's kind of the most obvious move. You can't see the whole board now. Let me shrink my chess base board so it'll all fit on the screen. Okay, that should be better. I played d4. Dale played rook to b4. I said, well, I could play d3 here, but why don't I move the knight that's not guarding the c6 pawn, guard my pawn on d4 and hit the rook and force him to either go back where he came from, where I can fork him, or give up the exchange here. So he gives up the exchange. He plays rook takes a4. I take with the pawn. So now I'm not threatening to play d3 anymore, but his bishop on c1 is completely trapped. He brings his knight to the middle with knight e4. I move my king out of the pin of the f-pawn and also guard the d6 square. He sticks his knight in on f6. I say my knight's a good path piece. I'm going to play knight to b7 and then go up to maybe maybe a5 and then c4, or maybe c5 and later maybe look at pushing my pawn to d3. Dale plays g5. I play knight c5. Dale plays bishop e2, trying to stop me from pushing the pawn to d3. I play rook b8, threatening to penetrate my rook on the b file. Dale says, well, let's get those connected pass pawns rolling. That's the reason I can do it. And I play the clever move, knight to b3. Now, if he takes, I'm going to practically get a queen when I take back with the pawn. And if he doesn't take, I can take the bishop and penetrate with the rook and then bring my knight up behind it. So Dale plays knight e4. I take the bishop. Play rook b2. Now I'm also threatening to double rooks and mate him. His h-pawn isn't fast enough, and if I double rooks and play rook b1 check, it's going to be mate. So he plays rook h3. He can sacrifice his knight for 2 pawns on the c3 square to stop the mate. I said, go ahead and sack the knight for the 2 pawns. I'll be up a rook. He does. I take. He takes, hitting my knight. I just bring my knight up to d4. He saves his bishop. I check. He plays king to d2. I hit his nice h-pawn. He saves it by going to h5. I bring my rook to the middle. I'm up a whole rook. I have a million ways to win. I just have to make sure that h-pawn doesn't queen. He plays king e3. I hit his rook and his a-pawn. He can't keep the rook on the 3rd rank without trading it. I hit his bishop. He saves the bishop with bishop f3. I played rook to g3, pinning the bishop. He pushes the pawn. I set up. I guess I'm not doing anything. I admit my mistake. I go back. You don't see weaker players do that much. They hate to take back their previous move, but sometimes you have to. He pushes the pawn to h6. I said, okay, I'm going to keep an eye on that pawn with my rook on d8. He plays h7. I said, good, let's trade rooks. My rook on d8 can watch that pawn. Brings his bishop up, hoping to get a second pawn. I say, good luck. He guards it. I take. He takes. Now his pawn's isolated. I could block it with the king now and then get my rook back in the game. First I win the pawn on a3 with the knight. He brings his king over, hits my knight, and I just push the pawn. He brings the bishop back to hit my knight, and I guard my knight. Now I'm threatening to play rook takes h7, bishop takes h7, and then a2 and get a queen. So he has to bring the king back. Now what I should do is bring my king over and stop the pawn with my king so my rook can help my other pawn queen. I do bring my king over. He hits the knight. I said, go ahead and take the knight. I can win with my rook. I don't care if I lose the a-pawn. I hit his pawn. He breaks to try to get another pass pawn. I said, thank you very much. He takes. And I check, winning his bishop, and he resigns. So if we go back to the position that we originally looked at for our analysis, If we go back to where I played D4, I'm scrolling back here. There's the D4 move. If I turn on the engine, if we go to home, add kibitzer, this is chess base, stockfish 17, okay. Now you see a very small board and the engine will pop up here. We can make the board bigger. All right, and now we have to move the board to the right so you can see it. Whoops. So you can see the analysis. And you can see after D4, Dale's move rook B4 is his best move, but I'm just winning because he's going to have to give up the exchange there. So I'm -2 after I make that move. If I had played another move, the computer says D4 is not clearly the best, but the best moves are not much better than D4. I gave myself an exclamation point, but the computer says, oh, if I had played knight on E to C6 and then tried to do stuff like D4 on the next move, is just as good, if not slightly better. So you can see that from the engine analysis, which is what you always want to do. All right, so what's the idea of today's video? The idea of today's video was don't hand wave, think clearly, think in sequences. After the sequence, evaluate the sequence. Obviously, Dan can't evaluate as well as Stockfish 17 can, but try to think in specific sequences. Don't just hand wave in these kind of positions. Try to see what might happen. Get a feel for what he would do and what you would do, what's safe, what's not safe, what would probably happen, and then evaluate it and try to pick the best line that you can. Okay, hope you enjoyed today's video. You can say thumbs up. You can give me a like on the video. You can subscribe to the channel, but I always say the best thing you can do is tell your friends about the channel. I've won the award for best video instruction twice out of the last 4 years, but not that many people watch my videos. We need that word of mouth, so you can go to your chess club and say, hey, go to Dan Heisman Chess on YouTube and see some great instructional videos. If you do that, I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye.